Hello, welcome back to the Midnight Quill podcast. In our fourth episode, we're talking about writer's block. I'm one of your hosts, Tegan, also known as TC Emerys. I'm a writer, professional ghostwriter, and fiction editor. My debut short story collection, The Weight of Rain, was released last year. Now, over to my co-host.
My name is Maisy Osbon. I'm primarily a screenwriter, but I occasionally dabble in poetry too.
Recently, I've seen writers, particularly on Facebook groups and other social media, debating whether writer's block is a myth or not. One side argues that writer's block is just a manifestation of procrastination, and the other argue that writer's block is a natural part of the creative process. So I thought maybe we'd start by talking about that.
I definitely don't think writer's block is a myth. I don't know where that has originated, but I definitely don't believe it because I think every writer has experienced it, from a writer who has just begun their writing journey to bloody Stephen King, everyone has experienced writer's block in whatever form it sort of happens to happen to them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think from what I've seen, it's almost a side effect of toxic productivity culture. That's what it seems to be. This like denial that writer's block is a thing because people they tend to say on these posts that it's because they view procrastination of any kind, even if it's a creative process, as like the worst possible thing that can happen, which I don't personally agree with, because I feel, especially with creative processes, sometimes you have to take a bit of time and sit back and have a think,
Definitely.
But I'm kind of on the fence with this one, which is why I put it in today's topics, because since I've been ghostwriting professionally, I do understand this idea of writing through a block, because occasionally when I'm ghostwriting, you do get to a point where you're like, I don't know what I want to say next, because you've written so many words that day and you're writing someone else's ideas. And sometimes it is just like, and it is possible to write through a block. So I do understand that point of view. But at the same time, I don't understand why writers are so judgmental to other writers. Do you know what I mean? Like, if you are saying a blanket statement like writer's block is a myth, and if you're finding yourself blocked, then you're just procrastinating, then you're just being judgmental towards other people's processes, and that's not fair.
It's so negative. It's such a negative way of looking at it.
It is.
It's like in the same way that writing is different for everyone, and everyone gets to their sort of conclusion differently. It's the same way for writer's block. You hear about writers who get up really early in the morning and say 4 till 6, this is the time that I write. In the same way that is not going to work for other people, and certainly wouldn't work for me. It's the same for writer's block. I think it's different for everyone, but we all experience it, definitely.
There's a brilliant YouTuber actually called Kate Kavanagh. I'm sorry if I've pronounced her surname wrong. She's an author and writer, and she does YouTube videos where she tests out other writers' writing routines, including Stephen King, J.K. Rowling, a few others. And it's really interesting because she tends to find roughly the same amount of productivity, but the outcome is always a bit different. And sometimes she's really uncomfortable with the routine or the way that they write, whether it's handwriting. She tests all kinds of different things, how they plan, how they plot, and it's a really good example of, one size doesn't fit all, basically, with writing. So go and check out Kate Kavanagh. She's really cool. So one school of thinking is that writer's block can be written through. And that's kind of what I was saying a minute ago with what I've found since I've been writing professionally, is that, sometimes you can push through. So I wanted to talk about some exercises for writing that will help get people through their blocks. I love short stories. I love writing short stories. I love reading short stories. And I heard a writer once say that we need short stories whether we're novelists or script writers or poets, because there's something really useful to a writer about ticking off a box, like finishing a little piece of fiction and being like, that's done, I can put it aside. And I think that's what it is. There's a great power in restraint of words, of restricting yourself to only sharing certain details about a story.
I totally get that. I recently read a quote by Kurt Vonnegut, who most famously wrote Slaughterhouse-Five, and he was talking about, like, with short stories, he never writes the transition, like, of a character into a room. He never writes that, like, they opened the door, they went in, they did this.
Yeah.
He was like, he leaves out all the transitional moments so that you just have the action, you just have the most important part. And it was such a simple thing, but I went back through a short story that I've recently written, which is, funnily enough, set completely in one setting, in one dining room, and I took out almost every part where a character moved from inside the room to outside the room, and it was so good. I cut down like half a page,
Yeah.
But it's such a good idea of that idea of that restraint that you were talking about.
That's a really great exercise. That's just like in the film Inception, when Leonardo DiCaprio's character is talking about, in a dream you never experience those like transitional bits, and I love that. I think it's such a great example of story writing, because in the film, I think they're on a rooftop talking, and then the next scene they're at a cafe. But his point is that is actually how the characters experience that time as well as the audience. And I thought that was really good to like point out that the strangeness that we just happily believe in films, of like there was no bit in between them going from the roof to the cafe. Yeah, and that's something you can do with writing, and especially in short stories. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about microfiction, because I think that lots of writers are scared of microfiction. And I understand why. When I first started writing microfiction, I thought the only point of it was to show off the restraint that you can do. But I entered this competition called the 53 word story, which there's a link on my blog to that competition. Go and have a go. Even if you aren't interested in writing microfiction in general, just go and have a go at it, because it is so interesting to sit down. And the first time I did it, I thought, 53 words, that's loads of words. But it's not. And you end up, I suppose it's a little bit like Twitter in some ways, like going through and thinking, well, why did I put, an and there when I could get away with a comma or something like that? Because every single word becomes precious, and the impact it has is important because there aren't as many other words, And so I found myself taking a word that I usually probably would have let slip through the net, no problem, like nice, or something like that, and thinking, well, that's not a powerful enough statement, or that's not working how I want it to in the sentence, because every single word is so important. So there's this other exercise that I like to do, which I call a character cul-de-sac, because it's a dead end, and it's fine to be a dead end. And the idea is that you either take characters that are already in existence in your brain, from your work in progress, or ones you've played around with before. You could even borrow characters from a book, do fan fiction, Harry Potter and Hermione, or whatever you want to do. I've also got a random character generator on my blog post, which is great fun to play with, because when you create a random character, they just tend to create themselves, and I love that feeling of taking just a few traits and having like an entire character spring up into your head and being like, perfect. And the idea is just to write a short piece with these random characters and just let it become a dead end. Let it like dry up that thought, that character, that whatever, and then go back to your writing and see what difference it makes. And I think you'll be surprised sometimes how much difference it makes just to like play with a couple of characters, because we don't often do that. We're so worried about plot when we're writing, especially a novel, that sometimes we just don't play with our characters and let them breathe. So.
That's really cool. I find, especially when I'm writing, I feel like this is the character, this is what the character would do. Like they're almost already completely formed in a way that's often detrimental to your actual writing process, you know?
Yeah.
That's a really good exercise to try. One thing that I like to try and do is, if I'm struggling with a scene in particular, I'll try and like rewrite it in a different format. So I have like an idea that I'm trying to mold into a novel loosely at the minute. It originally started as like a 5-minute play. I submitted it to a thing called Bitter Pill Theatre, and it was like a 5-minute play. They have I think it's like a monthly submission.
Oh, cool.
And it can only be like 2 characters and 1 setting and all these sort of these restrictions. But that once I'd written that and written these 2 specific characters, it made me want to write more, and then that's how it sort of developed into something different. So sometimes if you're really struggling, like even if you tried like writing poetry from the point of view of the character, you know, just delving in and out of different formats, it could be really good to do.
No, I completely agree. Something that I have tried and find very difficult, and I think sometimes when you find it difficult, that's the most fruitful thing, is turning a short story or a novel, or, you know, whatever I'm working on, whichever piece of writing, into poetry. I find poetry very challenging. Always illuminates something that I didn't know it was going to, and sometimes it's extremely painful, but it's really useful to play with formats. Definitely agree. Yeah. So let's talk about inspiration. Do you think that inspiration is organic, or do you think that you need to seek inspiration?
I hate to be basic, but I do think it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
I do think it's a bit of both because like sometimes inspiration just hits you out of absolutely nowhere. And sometimes it's like you might have had an idea in your head and then 4 years later something triggers it, you know? So one thing that I do is I keep like a list of inspiration.
Yeah.
So it will be like books, movies, quotes, all that sort of thing. And whenever I feel like unmotivated, just go back to that list, you know, go back, reread the things that you love and the things that, you know, make you want to write.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the downfall, especially of a new writer, is to wait for those moments of pure inspiration, because obviously they're wonderful, aren't they? Like that moment where it's just so easy and like you're so inspired to write that your fingers just fly and it's you know, it's easy to get out. That's great, but writing is not all that. A lot of writing is, you know, using what's already in your head and just going for it. Like you can't wait for those perfect moments. And I think the thing about inspiration that people don't talk about often enough is that it's rarely going to come when you're sat at your desk. It's often going to come, you know, when you're out, or most people say in the shower, or for me it's when I'm just about to fall asleep, which is why I have a notebook by my bed.
That's good. That's a good idea.
Well, it's good, apart from that sometimes the things that I write are pure garbage because it's 3 a.m, you know. And sometimes I go back the next morning and I'm like, what the, like,
Yeah.
you know, it's very difficult. Yeah, because I feel like if I got up and wrote at that moment, maybe what I would write would be okay. Do you know what I mean? But the sort of scribbled down idea is normally complete rubbish. Yeah, but so inspiration is rarely going to come in those moments when you need it to come. And so if you're waiting for it, you're never going to write anything.
Yeah.
And sometimes it comes to you once you've already done a bit of hard slog, once you've been sat at the computer plugging for ages, and that's fine too.
Yeah.
I mean, you've just got to ride the waves when they come, but you've also got to make your own waves. Like,
Definitely.
yeah.
I think sometimes you need to just leave the page and go and live a bit,
Yes.
because I know, especially when you look at like stories that you wrote as a teenager, the reason that most of them are probably shit is because you hadn't lived yet. Like,
Yes.
you hadn't experienced perhaps the things that you needed to be able to execute that story perfectly.
Yeah.
So I definitely think getting away from your computer, your typewriter, whatever you're writing on,
Yeah.
you need to go out. Obviously, with COVID, keep
Yeah.
restrictions
Yeah.
in
Be
mind.
COVID safe,
Um,
everyone.
be COVID safe, but it's as you said, inspiration won't come when you're at your desk. It just
Yeah.
won't.
Yeah, I completely agree. You don't have to, travel to the Bahamas and stare at some beautiful white sand and
Yeah.
blue water to be inspired. Like anything can become inspiration. And so like Maisie was saying, your life experiences will become part of your writing whether you want them to or not. But it's unlikely to be the things that you think it's going to be, like that amazing experience you had, I don't know, watching a starling murmuration or something like that.
Mm.
Maybe that will be it, but probably not. And for an example, something that I'm ghostwriting at the moment, I used to do a lot of student proofreading, and I proofread a lot of essays by this guy doing a PhD in Taiwanese social care and
Oh wow.
looking after the elderly in Taiwan. He's Taiwanese. Um, and, I never thought that that would come back, but it did. I was ghostwriting for a client yesterday and I wrote this character and it ended up writing in this bit about caring for her elderly Taiwanese parents. Like,
Wow.
and yeah.
Full
So,
circle.
and it was like I didn't do it on purpose. My brain just did it because it's somewhere in my head. It was,
Mm.
something that I read about 50,000 words for him probably when I was proofreading. So like it's just going to be in there now. Um
Yeah.
so I suppose what I'm saying is there isn't good inspiration and bad inspiration. Sometimes inspiration is from something quite dull or
Yeah.
everyday seeming things. It's not all going up the Eiffel Tower or having the best meal of your life, or like
Yeah.
inspiration can come from any random thing, and it's fine to let it be like that. You need all kinds of life experiences is basically what I'm
Yeah.
saying, not just the
Definitely.
amazing ones.
Definitely. And I think like one thing that you can do if you're sort of sitting there thinking, I really want to write something, but I just don't have anything to say, ask people to tell you stories.
Mm.
Genuinely. I've got this if Becky is listening, I doubt she will, but if she is, I used to work with a lovely girl called Becky.
Mm.
And I remember, this was like years ago, I remember her telling me that her sister's boyfriend was an accountant for a nunnery, and it's something that I like wrote down in my phone, and I'm going to use it at some point. It was just such a peculiar, um, unexpected little
Yeah.
gem that just through talking to her, just about her life, just about, different things, you are going to find those gems by
Yeah.
talking to people, by
Yeah.
hearing different stories. Whether it's talking to your nan about stories from when she was a child, or whether it's just talking to your colleague across the tills,
Yeah.
you're going to find these really good gems that are going to
Yeah.
trigger something in you to write about them. And that's the beauty of
Absolutely.
talking.
For our final thoughts, I just wanted to address something that maybe isn't talked about often enough. This idea that if you're a writer, you have to always be a writer and you can't
Mm,
take breaks. And I see a lot of people, again, on the Facebook writing groups, who maybe haven't written since they were a teenager, and they're, they've had a whole life. They're in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And they want to come back to writing after a long break. So
Yeah.
I thought we would just talk about what is essentially a monumental writer's block of decades. How
Mm.
how do you return to writing after a long break, whether it's weeks, months, or years and decades?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really tough thing, isn't it? Because I think when like writer's block, in however long that takes, when that sets in, so does imposter syndrome, which is something that like we've spoken a lot about off
Yeah.
air as well, about the effects of it. And it's really hard because you do get to a point, even if you've like taken a few months off writing, you get to a point where you think, am I a writer? Like,
Yeah.
should I be doing this? Can I ever do something as good as what I thought the last bit was? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
It,
absolutely.
it's the feeling. You are a good writer. You've just got to get over that feeling, you know? So
Absolutely.
yeah, I can't imagine like 30, 40 years if I never write again until then. I can't even imagine how that would feel.
So I wrote a tweet a while ago that I just want to share, which is exactly, what Maisie's saying here. Writers create. That's the only prerequisite. Not publication, not acclaim, not sales. Whether on paper, a computer, or in your head, if you create sentences, scenes, worlds, characters, you are a writer.
Mm.
And I think that if you've ever written in your life, even if it was, just a couple of lines when you were a teenager or something,
Yeah.
and you want to come back to it and you feel like you're an imposter because you haven't done it in so long, you are still a writer. You've always been a writer, because
Mm.
I don't think you realize how your own mind has been working this whole time,
Mm.
to make worlds that maybe you'll eventually put into a book or a poem or a play, or
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I think like storytelling, story crafting is something that's been around for thousands of years, and it's never going to go away, whatever happens to our tiny planet. Storytelling is so important, and I think if you've felt that once, you can feel that again, and it's it's just finding a way through that
Yeah.
block that we've been talking about, easing yourself back into it, and back
Absolutely.
into easing yourself back into what you really love, which at the end of it is the writing. It's not the business side of it, or how can
Yeah.
I get more
Or the
likes for
publication, or
this.
yeah.
Yeah,
No.
exactly.
I love that term you use, story crafting, because I think that we sometimes fail to see the story crafting in our everyday lives. Like
Mm.
my dad, I don't think he would consider himself a writer. I'm sure he has written some things,
Mm.
but he, he can craft stories when he's talking to other people and when he's telling his life and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
And I think people undervalue that as
definitely.
a means of communication. You have to remember that before the printing press, oral tradition stories were, and still are in lots of other cultures. I'm talking about Western Europe specifically because that's where we live.
Mm.
But pre the printing press in Western Europe, oral tradition stories were, one of the most important ways of telling a story.
Mm.
And that's why we don't have a lot of sort of things written down from those older time periods, because
Yeah.
you would go and watch someone tell a story, or
Mm.
listen to your grandmother tell a story, or and if you want to come back to it, you can do it. We believe in
Yeah,
you.
100%.
So I think we've said everything we want to say about that. Basically, you can come back to writing whenever you want. It's okay. And if you're struggling with imposter syndrome, I actually do have a blog post written by storybud.net creator Ray Commons, who is a wonderful man and writer. So go and have a look on the blog if you feel that if you're feeling like an imposter when you're coming back to writing, because there are lots of other people who feel like that as well, and it's okay. So thank you very much for listening to the 4th episode of the Midnight Quill podcast. Leave us a comment. What do you do when you get writer's block? We will try and reply to as many as possible. Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any of our future episodes. We also have a Patreon where you can support us if you'd like to. For as little as £1 a month, you can listen to some extra content. There's some branded merchandise with Luna Bird art, Rhiannon, our wonderful artists, amazing handiwork on them. They're so pretty. So go and check that out, and we will see you next time.